If the nervous system is not in a calm state, a parasympathetic dominant state, the body cannot heal. And so that might be how we're using food, how we're supporting digestion, understanding that need to calm. And part of that calm is being able to not walk such a tight line where we have so many things we can and can't do that we're constantly in an alarm state and a worry state. And I had one of those conversations this week where I literally had to convince somebody that they could put blueberries in their fat, fiber, protein boosted quinoa for breakfast because they didn't know what to eat for breakfast after having lab results.
Hi, Andrea. Welcome to the Integrative Women's Health Podcast. I'm thrilled to have you. So introducing everyone, this is my dear friend and brilliant colleague, Andrea Nakayama. Welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. I am thrilled, as always, to spend time with you.
So I think we can have a lot of fun today. And our audience is primarily women's health and wellness professionals. And so this gives us an opportunity to get a little nerdier. And I want to talk about what's top of mind for you when it comes to the conversation around perimenopause, menopause, and hormones. And I think particularly for women over 50, because I think we've talked a lot on this podcast about younger women who are just starting perimenopause, but there's a lot even more questions over 50. What's safe for me? What do I need to keep doing forever? You know, that kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I've been really diving in as a functional medicine nutritionist to the realm of longevity. And I'm seeing longevity being spoken about by a lot of younger women under 50 who are kind of the trailblazers in the longevity space. I just turned 59. It is a different story as we hit postmenopausal periods or seasons in our life. And the entire conversation around longevity is really different. There are different factors that we're confronting as we are women who are aging. So what I see a lot of are protocols, pills, whether it's bioidentical hormone therapy or high protein diets, or all the things that are being touted as the longevity solves that are missing the mark in a lot of ways. And it really does come back to my approach in functional nutrition, which is grounded in epigenetics, omics, and precision practices where we are embracing the need for the bio-individuality of the person in a trauma-informed lens, which is missing from a lot of the conversation. So that's the big picture, but I know we can dive into elements of that.
Yeah. So both of us are, trained and licensed functional nutritionists. And I think when we talk about nutrition, let's start there because you're right that some of the loudest voices in menopause medicine, if you will, are saying every single woman over 45, if you will, needs to be on a certain hormone stack and 100 and I won't over exaggerate, but really they're saying like 120 grams of protein a day and need to be powerlifting as absolutely much as possible. And yet I'm 51. I just spent 5 weeks in Europe doing nothing but playing with my family, taking a lot of walks, eating and drinking literally everything I wanted, certainly not tracking my protein intake, although I did eat plenty of protein, and did not lift a weight. And yet came back biochemically, if you will, personalized, healthier. So let's start with the conversation about protein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from a functional nutrition perspective, and I've been a functional medicine nutritionist training other providers for 2 decades now, my conversation has really shifted away from the rules into broader principles, because I've seen those rules really do people harm, and more harm than good, if they're not the appropriate rules for them, or if they can't adhere to the rules. It's also a very privileged opportunity to be able to eat some of these ways that we're being told and not do it in harmful ways. Just say for protein, quality really matters a lot. We could be bringing in a lot of inflammatory fats when we're eating a high protein diet that doesn't honor quality. So my conversation around nutrition has shifted pretty significantly since the time I started my practice, where I might be talking more in terms of rules. So the principles that I like to adhere to in nutrition, and this will bring me to your question about protein, are number one, fat, fiber, protein at every meal. And we can look at quality for that. But that's going to help with our blood sugar balance, which is going to be part of the conversation why protein can be detrimental. Eating the rainbow, so making sure we're getting not just lots of fiber, but lots of the micronutrients and phytonutrients that actually support our body's ability to utilize the proteins that we are consuming, and knowing our yes, no, maybe list. And this may be the place that most clients or patients need to start, because if you're working with a client or patient who doesn't even know that there's foods that make them not feel good, but they never feel good, we got to start with uncovering that kind of interoception, that understanding of what makes me feel better, what makes me feel worse. You came back from Europe saying, I feel better. And that's because you're tuned into your body. A lot of the people we're seeing aren't tuned in to what they're experiencing. And so there's those people who don't know and never feel good. And then there's the people who have gotten so tight in their rules that they're down to eating 3 foods. They haven't done the internal healing. So we've got to start in a more broad fashion and get away from these dogmatic rules that really promote a diet focused culture and how we're addressing things. When it comes to protein, protein can be turned to sugar in the body, as many of us know, through gluconeogenesis. And we have to understand that if blood sugar isn't balanced, if insulin isn't operating like it needs to for our blood sugar balance, that we can be misutilizing the proteins that we're consuming, and they could be doing more harm than good. Also, muscle, like you said, is really important. And as we age, our muscle loss increases pretty exponentially. And so we might not be feeding the muscle that we were at 35, at 40, at 45. And estrogen is a real player in that equation. So estrogen's going to help with that muscle build. And as our endogenous estrogen decreases, we're going to be at more risk. So all this to say that what I think often gets missed in a lot of this media promotion of dietary principles or rules is the individual and the physiological terrain that is helping us understand what's true for this person, and what we're seeing, or what I know I'm seeing with previous clients, students, friends, family members, is they've been following these rules to eat more protein and even to lift weights, but they are seeing negative results in their labs and in their body and in how they feel. And it's because they followed the rules without understanding the needs of the body. The other thing I just want to add, and I know I'm kind of on a roll here, Jessica, but want to hear your thoughts, is a lot of people are adding dairy that I'm seeing. I'm not saying dairy's good or bad, but what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that they weren't eating dairy because they determined it to be a no or on occasion food. And as they went into a high protein diet and all the cottage cheese frenzy started adding dairy en masse, which made them more constipated, which impacts the hormone metabolization and causes more problems. All this to say, we can't talk about food without talking about physiology.
Yes, that final piece you just said, I think, is so important, because when we're thinking about as practitioners, a lot of my students, and I'm sure your students come to you with this desire as well, is like, they're like, I've joined our perimenopause and menopause training program. I want the protocol. But I think how we have to shift our thinking is, how has your client arrived? In what state has she arrived? And then what are her goals? And so everything you said is so important, because most of our clients, if I can kind of generalize, so the most common 50-year-old, let's say, they're really tired, they're burnt out, they're overwhelmed, they're spinning too many plates. They don't have very stable blood sugar. They are not necessarily on adequate, appropriate dosing of estrogen support. So they are struggling with insulin resistance. They may be menopausal or perimenopausal or surgically menopausal, and very few of them have had much support in that transition. So that is a sort of a metabolic fire, right? And so you're circling back to where we need to start is actually anti-inflammatory phytonutrients, which is carbs.
Yes,
Usually.
absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
And that sort of panics people initially, because there's this idea that carbs are bad. And so I think as professionals, that's the first reframe. Step one is, so we have, and I think your point about the environment, the privilege, the environment in which we live in, diet culture, we certainly don't want people eating 120 grams of Big Macs a day, because then you're going to add inflammatory fats to the protein that's going to be converted to sugar pretty directly in their liver, stressing the liver. But what we do want is protein and amino acids enough to maintain and build muscle. And so if we start with the fact that most of our 50-year-old clients are a mess metabolically and are very stressed, and then have been told all these foods are dangerous, there is a level. So our step one is always nervous system regulation. And I think foods can be really powerful as nervous system regulation. And I think in particular, how you teach nutrition is interesting from that regard, because there's a lot of beauty to how you teach nutrition from like a seasonality lens. So talk about that, like how we could actually start, just almost like throw out the rules of macronutrient proportion and start with using food as to calm and stabilize the nervous system, and thus the metabolism as like a step one.
Yeah, there's so much I have to say to follow up on that. And I know you and I can go off on these topics. I do want to say something about bioidenticals that I'll come back to. But when I'm looking at nutrition, I shared those principles. We are also thinking through the lens of the functional nutrition matrix, which really mimics the functional medicine matrix. It's just a little simpler. And I'm always thinking through a model that I call 3 roots, many branches. Any sign, symptom, or diagnosis that your client or patient is experiencing is a branch. And there are medical individuals who are addressing the branch in a targeted fashion. I see our role in functional nutrition as coming down to the roots and to the soil that nourishes those roots. So for me, with any chronic health situation, any chronic sign, symptom, or diagnosis, the roots to any of those branches are the genes, digestion, and inflammation. And part of inflammation is exactly what you're talking about. To address inflammation, we need to clear, calm, enhance, and modulate. That's the soil around inflammation. We're often thinking I have to clear an infection and calm the immune system. But like you said, I really try to get people to think about that more broadly. If the nervous system is not in a calm state, a parasympathetic dominant state, the body cannot heal. And so that might be how we're using food, how we're supporting digestion, because nutrition without understanding digestion and digestive physiology is not functional, but understanding that need to calm. And part of that calm is being able to not walk such a tight line like you're talking about, where we have so many things we can and can't do that we're constantly in an alarm state and a worry state. And I had one of those conversations this week where I literally had to convince somebody that they could put blueberries in their fat, fiber, protein, boosted quinoa for breakfast because they didn't know what to eat for breakfast after having lab results. And that puts somebody in a panic state, and the body cannot heal. So when I'm thinking about addressing hormones at all, blood sugar is the basis of that, and then insulin, and then cortisol, to your point, that nervous system regulation as well, digestive piece there, then thyroid, then sex hormones. We're often taking a top-down approach, and we're missing the opportunity to provide that physiological calm.
Yeah. And so in our practice, I collaborate with a nurse practitioner. So sometimes we work with hormones, or, our clients are working with a local gynecologist or PCP who will provide their hormones. And often we sort of slow down the process rather than sort of like the protocol of everyone needs, X amount of estrogen, and everyone needs X amount of progesterone and X amount of testosterone. We're trying to, like you said, top down, just fill up the gaps. Instead, we very commonly start with calming the nervous system with lots of different practices, including adding a lot of phytonutrients and kind of re-enjoying eating. But also we often start with progesterone instead of estrogen so that people sleep better. What are your thoughts on kind of the integration between hormone replacement therapy and nutrition?
Yeah, I love that. And similarly, I am absolutely pro bioidentical therapies. I like to start low and go slow. A lot of what I'm seeing is that the medical providers who are administering hormone therapy are going multiple hormones at once and higher dose. And I'd rather just build our way there. I do find that starting earlier than later helps. I personally do not feel good on bioidenticals. If anybody out there feels the same, I'd love to hear from folks who don't. They don't feel good to my body, and I am tuned in to that sensitivity, which I think is another piece of the equation. So I think what you're doing and what you're talking about, that tandem and partnered work, starting low and going slow and having somebody really tune in to what makes a difference, always incorporating progesterone when estrogen is part of the therapy or not, but can we do enough with progesterone alone? But sleep, poop, and blood sugar balance are my non-negotiables. And I do think that progesterone can and does help with sleep. I think there are other things that can help with sleep as well. And so progesterone for me isn't the first route that I'm going to go for supporting sleep, because we may be looking to address something physiological with what we think is the fix, that it is because of low progesterone. It might not be low progesterone. So what I will say is, from a functional nutrition perspective, my job is to focus on not hormone levels, but hormone metabolism. So what I'm looking at specifically and training providers to look at is, okay, we have to create it, we have to transport it, we have to utilize it, and we have to excrete it. So that's our hormone metabolization. And then within there's more research really illuminating hormone sensitivity. So what looks good or bad, high or low on a lab may not be what that woman is experiencing within her own body when small doses or small shifts are happening.
Yeah, I think I'd like to talk about that for just a second. We absolutely see in our practice people who don't tolerate, let's just start with progesterone, but I would like to talk about estrogen as well. Supplemental progesterone, oral micronized bioidentical progesterone. It's very easy to access. About 10%, and even this is just in the data, of women have a bad response to that. They feel more anxious, they can't sleep. And I think what often happens is the practitioner is just like, well, I don't know, that just didn't work. Or try it longer, you just have to adapt. There's not this idea that for some women, either it's the wrong time, it's the wrong dose, or the hormone is not being well metabolized, or the body doesn't have the capacity to use it. So what we've seen is when we slow it way down, and again, one hormone at a time. First of all, for some women, it's absolutely not the right tool. Any tool could be absolutely not the right tool. And I think I get asked this all the time. I'm sure you do too. The question would be something like, are blah, blah, blah good? Are estrogen patches good? Are GLP-1s good? That is not the question.
Correct.
Is this tool the right thing to support this woman's biochemistry, physiology, symptoms, et cetera, now? And so one of the things we would do with progesterone, if people do have that sort of, I call it the like anti-Benadryl effect, right? You get those
like a paradoxical response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those kids who take Benadryl and then bounce all over the plane, right? So the same thing can happen with progesterone. You should be having this nice deep sleep. No, you're wide awake, anxious. We often just dramatically decrease the dose, but also what you said was start with all the supportive tools. Has this woman been getting adequate fat long enough to build her own progesterone, maybe ever, and maybe not if she's had disordered eating or been on a low fat diet for a really long time or has a gallbladder issue. Like there's lots of reasons, all the way through to, is she pooping? How's her liver? Etc. So I think that, and then estrogen, I think is even more interesting in, I keep telling people my perimenopause book is going to be perimenopause in the age of the zombie apocalypse. So there's a lot going on right now, but one of the things we are absolutely seeing in this age of the zombie apocalypse, otherwise known as the continuing COVID pandemic, 40 to 55-year-old women are 45% more likely to get long COVID. And one of the key factors of long COVID is mast cell activation syndrome. And so estrogen destabilizes mast cells in many cases. So if you have a client who starts on estrogen, she has all the symptoms, right? She's hot flashing. It seems like estrogen would be the holy grail. Like, is estrogen good? Like, the answer would be yes. And then they take it and they start having more burning pain, more hot flashes, more bladder pain. Back up and do exactly what you just said. How's her immune system stabilizing her mast cells? How's her digestion? So anything else you've seen, because I've actually seen people, once we get their mast cells stabilized, they do really, really well on estrogen. Any other things you've done for people who maybe can't tolerate estrogen initially, or, other things we do, maybe we just don't use estrogen. What are some of the other tools?
Yeah, I think it does come back to the matrix. So let me just talk through the matrix, in that when we look at the matrix as a whole, it has 3 sections to it. And these are all things that you also use and think through in your own ways, Jessica. So like just adding to the ways our work kind of, pairs so well with each other. I call it the story, the soup, and the skill, right? So the story in functional medicine, our antecedents, our triggers, and our mediators. And I'm going to come back to that because I think it's grossly overlooked in functional medicine practices. And it's what really took me down the path of more trauma-informed narrative medicine. And your practice is so trauma informed from the get-go because you're really hands-on with an individual, but that's not the case for a lot of what we get in media. The soup in the center of the matrix is the full body systems. It's the systems biology, and those hormones are just a piece of the puzzle. When I'm teaching people and they're asking me, what should I do for this hormone issue or that hormone issue, I will pull up the matrix and show that we are looking at a tiny piece of the whole map. And if we are looking at that tiny piece, what are we missing? And the answer is obvious, everything else. We are missing everything else. So like you mentioned, we have to be thinking about the gut. We have to be thinking about the liver and detoxification. The metabolization of hormones is very, very important to be thinking about. And metabolization might be something that we can address with the immune and inflammatory balance, with gut function, with detoxification optimization. But it may just be the season of life and how that body has not had that hormone in that way to be able to utilize in an appropriate way. So like when I said, I think it's better to start earlier, you're going from the endogenous production of hormones to supporting low and slow the exogenous introduction. If the body is adaptable, I'm going to say this is true for me. I'm going to knock on wood and say if the body is adaptable and has gotten accustomed to not having that hormone production, then bringing it in may cause more harm than good, more problems than not, because it's adapted to not having that. And how many generations of women before us have done that adapting through lifestyle practices without having the significance of the hormonal symptoms that we've experienced. So again, I am all for bioidentical hormone therapy. I just think it's very individualized, and addressing our hormone function may be about full body systems or systems biologically managing and adapting to changes in the body. And it may be when we start there's so many factors that have to be looked at in that very individual way. So I said the story, the soup, which is that physiological function. The skill is where people are asking us, is this good or bad? Should I use a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor? Like, is it good or bad? And it's like, well, why are we using it? And what are we looking to gain from it before we're just introducing something? So the skill has to match the person and the physiological terrain. And when we think like that and see the whole instead of the part, that's where I believe we have increased clinical results.
I think that's really important because when you talk about the matrix having these different sections, to just explain that to people a bit more, we've got the endocrine system, we've got the immune system, we've got the nervous system, digestive system, musculoskeletal, et cetera. Those are the other systems. And so going back to that estrogen example, someone is prescribed an estrogen patch, they don't do well, their bladder pain increases, they feel bad, their sleep is off, whatever. So we look at immune system, we look at mast cells. We also could look at nervous system, because what if someone has a really deep family history of breast cancer, let's say, and for generations have been told, never use estrogen, it's going to be dangerous. That can be deep in their subconscious. And so the nervous system could drive a response. Or it could be circulatory system. One of the things in the original women's health study that helped us give information about, they didn't interpret their data very well. But one of the things that we do know from that study is that it is possible that if there's been too long of a time, certainly the vascular system may not like a new addition of estrogen. And, and then each system left and right. And so the good news is, though, is if we know that, maybe estrogen is not the tool in this example. Now we have the opportunity to go system by system.
And we may get to a place where we don't need that intervention. Like
Correct,
if our goal is to help a person feel better, not take hormones, right? Like our goal is, right? So, and I know you agree with that, but I'm just like saying that to the, so many of the providers that think, sometimes that's the answer, that if we can give somebody more of the tools to have more of the mediators in their own toolkit, you went away, you felt great. If you didn't, your toolbox to right size what's happening for you. And that to me is the definition of health, where it's not so narrow and so dependent, and it has a little bit of wiggle room for us to live, which is a part of the longevity equation. When we are so restricted and so tied to all the things we have to do, we're not actually supporting longevity, even though we are doing the things that promise us longer, healthier spans.
I love that point you just made. And this is the next question I wanted to ask you, because I think we really do need another perspective on this idea of longevity. The reality is that a lot of the men in this field, not all of them, because some of them I think are just deep thinking clinicians, but I saw a post from Brian Johnson as an example, just a couple, like within the last couple of days. And he basically said, look, my desire and mission was like, he was looking for sort of a purpose, and then he had almost like a scientific curiosity, which I fully support. His true goal is to just scientifically figure out if we can not die. And I mean, hey, more power to him. But for the vast majority of people, and I think the whole longevity conversation has been built about that we're going to live to be 100, 120. Like that's almost like a given. If you just follow these 6 steps, but you have to be all in, and you've got to be, testing your VO2 max and wearing your data tracker and wearing your all the time. 2 problems with that. You can do absolutely everything right and still get cancer, still get hit by a bus, still get heart disease, still get a chronic autoimmune condition. You can do absolutely everything right and still get sick or die. And no one says that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so interesting. Wait, was that number 1? I was like, only 2?
To me, that's number 1. Like just acknowledging that it is not 100% in your control. That said, I'm not walking around telling people like start smoking and like eat 40 Big Macs a day. But the second piece that's not addressed in longevity conversation, which you touched on, which I think is even more important. Well, I think that first point's a little bit important because right now I do think we have a lot of people feeling shame.
Correct.
For being sick.
Yes.
It's not your fault.
No. And if I can just jump in on that point, I've been leading a longevity book club called The Long View this past year. And we're reading a lot of the books and a lot of the bro literature, that really is about the science and technology of aging. And I think that it is about the science and technology. That's something different than the way we live our lives. Like the pursuits of the technology are like what Brian Johnson is talking. What's possible? The truth is, not a lot of people have lived past 120. There are more people getting to 120, but not necessarily past it. And the truth is, everybody's talking about health span versus lifespan. And Dr. Peter Attia probably says it best with like avoiding the 4 horsemen, the things that we are more susceptible to as we age. And what influence do we have and what influence do we not have to contract metabolic disorder, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, or more immune issues that we might be subject to. It's happening because our bodies are aging. It is entropy, and we are more susceptible. We do have some influence, but that influence is not control. And in the book club, we are really also reading about death and dying, because I don't think we can talk about longevity without talking about aging and the physiological realities of aging. And we can't talk about longevity or aging without talking about dying and death. And as somebody who lived through the death of my husband at a young age, 23 years ago now, when he was just 34, it's not his fault that he got cancer. It's not my father's fault at 79 that he got cancer, right? And like you said, there's a lot of shame around this idea that we have control over those outcomes when there's so many other factors. So I think it's a broader conversation that we've made really, really narrow. Once again, it's what we do in health. We make it really narrow, and then we sell a lot of stuff that's meant to support what we're measuring, tracking, eating, taking, to support this idea of what's possible as opposed to being where we are. And then also embracing the other aspects that do support longevity, belonging, passion, purpose, these things that I call the pharmacy within, that also activate and turn off inflammatory mechanisms as well. Like they have physiological power.
Absolutely. And so to me, there's this conversation around longevity that's very aligned, especially for women, with diet culture, right? Like you have to do everything right. If you don't, you got older and it's your fault, Eat less, lift heavier weights, or eat more protein.
Eat more protein, intermittent fast, measure this.
Track everything. And I think the challenge with the conversation around this, at least from my perspective, is how, there's always a grain of truth, right? Like, of course, if we learn to nourish ourselves, we eat healthier, we enjoy the phytonutrients of a wide variety of colorful fruits and vegetables. We do sleep. And sometimes that involves tracking so we can get back in touch with, our own. We sometimes, like you said earlier, like there's this loss of being in touch with our own. How do I feel? I like barely even know. So all these tools are so helpful, but nobody talks about the other stuff that you were talking about. So for me, it's equally as important, if not slightly more important, to talk about what does longevity mean to you? What is a well-lived life? So if you had 2 years, what would you do with that time? Because when we have this longevity conversation, I think it also encourages people to put off, I have 30 more years. So they're not going to live. They're going to try to live longer, like live now.
Correct. And I think that what you're talking about is really what I've identified throughout all the reading and the discussions that we're having in the book club as a tension that exists between, like, what do we do? What's the doing part of it? And what's the being part of it? And how do we each make kind of a risk reward decision for ourselves that's about tuning in, being present, and inviting more of the things that really make us feel alive. I think that one of the most interesting things for me to experience, and you may be on the brink of this given where your kids are in their ages, is that there's a really significant role shift that occurs. And I think it's a bigger role shift for women that I think men have been going through it for a long time. And I think women are kind of experiencing it in a new way. And I'll talk into that. But there's a role shift that happens with who we are. So as a parent, I'm very close to my son, and it was just the two of us, given that his father passed when he was just an infant. But he's a young man. And my role as a parent really struck me as he was like having to push me away and do his own thing and, find his own way. That really hit me hard to recognize that it's not that he doesn't need me. He is choosing me. I'm not being pushed away, but I did a certain part of my job, and that role as parent needs to go through a transition. That kind of woke me up in a way that I wasn't anticipating. And then I think about my role in my business and my practice and all of these ways in which my role or roles have really defined me. And that as you age, especially out of your 50s, we're not done, but that role and that importance and what we put into those things is really shifting. And with that, I think comes a lot of nervous system dysregulation, not understanding who I am anymore, because I've been very tied to being a mother and being a business owner and being a this and a that and a leader and all of that for me is what led me down the longevity path, because I realized, oh, wait a minute, I have to be present for these shifts because they are really dysregulating, because I am attached to that definition of self.
Absolutely. I think many of us are. And I think the other thing, I was talking to one of our students earlier this week. She works with women primarily in their 60s and older. And this is a very new experience for women. Like, this is the only generation ever where women in their 60s and 70s, and to some extent 80s, were single or married by choice and had their own money. This has never happened before in history, and it might not happen for that much longer. We don't know, at least in this country. So I think that is really powerful because women have never, ever before had this level of choice. And so, like you said, it's kind of destabilizing. Like, I literally can do whatever I want, but also everything I thought I was, and, my role as a mom, which is a very, very strong role now as it was ever. My role as a person who works, my role as a high achiever, because to get to these levels, women had to be a high achiever in elementary school and high school and their whole life. It is very destabilizing. And yet I think such an opportunity that we're not slowing down and really considering enough.
Yes, 1,000%.
And I think we risk, because we know from the literature on men that when men retire from their jobs, if they've kind of been in the workforce most of their life, and that was their primarily defining role, if they retire with no plan, they actually are at a very high risk of dying within the next 2 years. So I think it's a really important conversation for women to be having, because women, it was sort of like, well, if you're still alive, you just step into being a grandma. That was what you did. That's it. But now we could do that, but we also might not. And I think that's a really important, that's a piece of this longevity conversation I've barely heard of.
I know. I feel like it's really, really important. And there are stories like Julia Louis-Dreyfus's podcast, what is that called?
It's not older than me, but it's
wiser than me. It's wiser than me. Yeah. And that's talking to like the trailblazers, the people who are in their late 70s and 80s, who kind of paved this way for us. We are the everyday trailblazers. There aren't a few of us. There's more of us than not. And I think one of the things that was also remarkable to me that really made me turn my attention towards women and longevity and this more broad conversation was watching my friends from college and high school who are so talented not being hireable anymore. And recognizing, yes, we know men have been through that, like you're talking about, but I'm watching people who I know are brilliant, and I've watched them form their brilliance in these beautiful careers, not have opportunities anymore. So again, that led me back to that idea of role. And I think it only starts to happen in our 50s. And there is purpose in really taking time to slow down and recognize, wait, what am I holding on to as part of my identity? And what is just innately part of my identity? Even going back to the things that make us smile, that give us purpose, that really light us up, and making time for those things, whether it's dancing or listening to music or playing music or, being creative or painting, or what are those things that we can reintegrate that give us life? Because I don't feel, I know I'm like nowhere near done if I get opportunity to keep creating, but that's not what the world is going to tell me if I went out and looked for a job, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think, and what's so ironic about that is that a woman in her 50s has so much more time than a woman in her 30s. Depending on how old your kids are to some extent. And then, as we were talking about earlier, we now have all these tools from functional nutrition, lifestyle medicine, nutrient supplementation, hormones, peptides. We actually have exercise, which is one of the most impactful. We have tools to have a very similar level of energy that we've had our entire adult lives for most of us. And yet, we'd have to be very, very precise about maintaining work and passions because, like you said, pretty much the world looks at a 55-year-old woman as old and retired.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think this goes back, Jessica, to what you were talking about with understanding the patient narrative around any intervention, hormone or otherwise, like you really identified. If a woman's been told her whole life, comes from a family of breast cancer survivors and is given estrogen and has a lot of fear inside, that this part of the story and the women that we're helping and understanding where they are in their life, what loss means, what grieving parts of our life, parts of our roles, like that, that terrain is also part of the equation, not just the marker on a piece of paper.
Yeah. And I also think without examining those underlying thoughts, those underlying traumas, just the things that are deep in our nervous system, without taking a moment to examine them. The other thing that I think really happens is women, the reality is your looks change as well. Your physicality changes. And that can be terrifying if you have no context. And that's part of what was really important to you or your family or your mother or, the messages of your community. It's interesting. My daughters are 21 and 14. So the older one is 90% like foot out the door. She barely calls me unless she needs money.
Still a daughter though. Daughter.
Absolutely. I mean, she's lovely. We're very close, yes. But she's very vigorously living her own life. Now we'll see what happens when she graduates from college and has to really live her own life, but she's enjoying it now. And then I still have a 14-year-old. And I think we're going to have also more and more women in their 50s and even 60s with teenagers, because more women are having their first or last child in their 40s. So, you still have teenagers when you're in your late 50s. And so that's it's a very different in terms of mothering. But it's also one of the things I see kind of being immersed in mom and, my daughters like to watch all kinds of like reality shows, and one of them's in a sorority, and we watch all these shows. And there's a show coming out right now. We're in rush season almost for colleges, like getting into a sorority. And in the South in particular, the mothers are very tied into this identity of like what their daughters are doing and wearing and da da da. And I think that that could be a culture of anything. Like if you were the VIP at Goldman Sachs and you want your daughter to be the VIP at Goldman Sachs, like there's almost, when women don't slow down for a second and examine what it is they want, in the same way that men have been doing this to their sons forever, we could have that same problem. It's like, well, my looks are fading, or my prestige at this job is fading, so my daughter better take it. When she might not want to do that at all.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where that kind of divide happens, and, the role shifts, because we don't necessarily get to shape it in the same way anymore, but people are holding on to it. And I think that, there's so much in what you just said in terms of our connection to our looks or our bodies. And, culture is upholding some version of ourselves that we're supposed to be. But this is another place of tension. It's not about like, oh, I'm just going to let it all go now because my body's changing. It is that desire to still be vibrant and be able to do the things that we do. I mean, for my birthday just a couple of weeks ago, I was on a really intense hiking trip with my boyfriend, who's a climber. I can't climb, but I do want to be able to hike, and it's not easy for me. It's not something I've done my whole life, and I can feel the differences and be working towards the goal of being able to do it with the exercises that I'm putting in when I'm not doing it, right? Like there's that tension between, it's not all about how I look, or the reality that this might not be something I can do at some point. And that's kind of cultural shift that I think we go through.
Yeah. And I think that comes back to what we were talking about before, that it isn't all or nothing. It's not that tracking your data or training for a big hike when you're 65, 75, 85, I don't care how old you are, is not valuable. But I think the point that we're both making here is that it's so rare to slow down. This is why coaches and functional nutritionists, having someone on your team that will allow you to stop every once in a while and be like, is this what I actually want to do? Or was this passed down? Or was this what wellness culture is telling me? Or is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Anything from 120 grams of protein to, you know, injecting stuff in your face. Like it's all kind of the same in that none of it is good or bad. It's about choosing it.
Yes. And for us as providers, I think, the simplest thing I always like to remind people is that those of us who are seeking our support are not broken. And we need to stop treating them like they need to be fixed. And they may be coming to us feeling like they are broken. And part of our job is holding that reality, creating space. I want to say one of the really simple practices that I've learned to do around that is when I am tracking someone's serum labs, I am color coding them so that the first thing I can say to them is, can we just take a moment to look at how much green there is on your lab tracker? Like, let's look at all the ways in which your body is functioning for you. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And so I think my biggest call to action for providers who want to be helping people to feel better is to anchor on that parasympathetic dominant trust in self and helping people find that inner voice that helps them to calm and know, this is what works for me, this is what doesn't. Oh, I have another tool. It's mine now as a patient. I don't need to rely on you to tell me everything to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, is anchoring people in their own resilience. And then, even if they have to apply to 100 more jobs than they had to apply to 10 years ago, but if they want to do it, they do it. Or if they have to grieve that their mother role is changing, they give themselves a space to do it.
Oh man, that one was hard.
Yeah, I bet. I'm not there yet, so I can
Yeah, it
say
was
that with more
post-college.
ease. Yeah, I'm not. My kids are still pretty. I was gonna say I still have a pretty active role as a mom. I'm not ready to.
I
I'm
won't
not
say
able to
mine is
grieve that yet.
over, but it's shifted, and I didn't see it coming. So that, I think, was like, it was a rude awakening. But I think I can only imagine that it happens for all of us in some ways, and sometimes not soon enough, and sometimes too soon.
Yeah, I bet there's some that are like, launch. That is one interesting thing about having them so far apart, is that like I sort of experience it once, get to take a breath, because like my oldest one is 1 year, a year and a half out of graduating from college, and the younger one hasn't started high school. So I almost get enough time to forget certain things before we do it again.
Yeah, and it'll be different the second time with a different person. But I think the things that you and I are illuminating for others, hopefully, in this conversation is that this part of our story is a part of our health. And so these things we're sharing are equally a part of how our hormones are behaving or metabolizing and what signs and symptoms we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Andrea. And I hope you've inspired some really exciting ideas for some of our practitioners to think about doing things like book clubs and doing longevity programs that do take some of this into account. Because I think leading programs like this, where women are in community within their communities, is even more powerful. And everyone listening to this has the opportunity to create that. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. I'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, Jessica.